What if I told you that the biggest divide in America isn't political, cultural, or even ideological? It's mathematical, a silent equation running in the background of everyday life, an equation that decides where you live, what schools your children attend, how long it takes to recover from failure, and whether failure is even allowed in the first place. Most people think the wealth gap is about money. It's not. Money is just the scoreboard. The real game is access to capital, to opportunity, to forgiveness when things go wrong. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Two people can work just as hard, play by the same rules, and still live in completely different economic realities. Not because of effort, not because of talent, but because the system compounds advantage for some and compounds risk for others. This isn't a crisis you can see in a single moment. It doesn't explode. It accumulates quietly, year after year. One tax rule here, one housing policy there, one education gap that turns into a lifetime income gap. By the time it shows up in the numbers, the outcome is already locked in. And here's the part nobody likes to admit. This system wasn't designed by accident. It evolved slowly, rationally, incentive by incentive. Every rule made sense on its own, but together they created something dangerous. An economy where starting position matters more than speed, where ownership grows faster than work, and where mobility feels like an exception instead of the expectation. Ask yourself this: how can the strongest economy in the world still leave millions one emergency away from collapse? How can innovation be everywhere, yet opportunity feels so scarce? How can wealth grow at the top at historic speed while the middle struggles just to stay in place? This is not about blame. And it's not about politics. It's about understanding how power actually moves through an economy, who gets leverage, who absorbs risk, and who pays the price when the system breaks down. Because once you see how the wealth gap really works, you realize something unsettling and something hopeful at the same time. Unsettling, because the gap will not close on its own. Hopeful, because anything built by rules can be rebuilt by better ones. So stay with me, because what we're about to talk about isn't theory. It's the real machinery behind money, opportunity, and the future of economic fairness in America. And once you understand it, you'll never see the economy the same way again. The wealth gap is often discussed as if it were an abstract statistic, a chart on a screen, a headline in a report, a number so large it loses meaning. But that framing is part of the problem, because the wealth gap is not theoretical, and it is not distant. It shows up in neighborhoods, in classrooms, in who gets a second chance and who never gets a first one. It is a structural economic challenge that quietly shapes outcomes long before talent, effort, or ambition ever enter the equation. When wealth concentrates at the top, it doesn't simply sit there. It compounds. It gains access to better education, stronger networks, cheaper capital, and lower risk. Meanwhile, millions of families live paycheck to paycheck, not because they lack discipline or drive, but because they are operating in a system where small setbacks carry permanent consequences. A medical bill, a rent increase, a job loss. These aren't temporary disruptions, they are derailments. That is the difference structure makes. This gap didn't emerge overnight, and it won't disappear on its own. Over decades, policy choices, market dynamics, and incentives have tilted in favor of asset holders over wage earners. Capital has been rewarded faster than labor. Ownership has outpaced participation. And as a result, wealth has become increasingly detached from productivity and increasingly tied to starting position. That is not a moral judgment, it is an economic observation. Systems produce the outcomes they are designed to produce. The danger here is not just inequality, it is inefficiency. When vast segments of the population are locked out of wealth-building mechanisms, home ownership, equity participation, quality education, entrepreneurial capital, the economy underperforms. We leave talent idle, we reduce mobility, we create fragility instead of resilience. An economy thrives when people believe effort leads somewhere. When that belief erodes, trust erodes with it. This is why reducing the wealth gap is not about redistribution for its own sake. It is about restoring balance to an economic engine that depends on broad participation. A healthy system rewards risk-taking, innovation, and long-term thinking, but it must also ensure that the starting line is not so uneven that outcomes are predetermined. If opportunity is inherited rather than earned, capitalism loses its legitimacy. We should be clear-eyed about this challenge. The wealth gap reflects how capital flows, how education is funded, how housing is zoned, how taxes are structured, and how opportunity is distributed. These are solvable problems, but only if we stop pretending the gap is accidental or inevitable. It is neither. It is the cumulative result of choices. And that is the most important point. If choices created this structure, choices can improve it. Not through slogans, not through shortcuts, but through disciplined, data-driven reform that expands access without destroying. Incentives. Because the goal is not to punish success. The goal is to make success achievable for more people. That is not only fair, it is how you build a stronger, more durable economy for the long term. Inequality has a dangerous quality that is often underestimated. Once it becomes embedded in a system, it begins to reinforce itself. Left unattended, it doesn't merely persist, it accelerates. Wealth generates access, access generates advantage, and advantage compounds into outcomes that appear merit-based on the surface, but are structurally predetermined underneath. This is not an emotional argument. It is how systems behave when incentives and rules favor accumulation over participation. Capital is patient, mobile, and protected. Labor is not. When the rules tilt too far toward capital alone, wealth begins to reproduce faster than opportunity. Those who already own assets gain leverage, lower borrowing costs, higher quality education for their children, better legal and financial advice, and insulation from risk. Those without assets face the opposite reality. They pay more for credit, take greater risks for smaller returns, and absorb shocks that permanently set them back. Over time, the gap widens not because effort diverges, but because the rules amplify initial conditions. This self-reinforcing cycle is visible across generations. Children born into wealth inherit more than money. They inherit stability, confidence, networks, and optionality. Children born without it inherit constraints. When education quality is tied to zip code, when housing appreciation rewards owners but penalizes renters, when capital gains are taxed more favorably than wages, we should not be surprised by the outcomes. We designed a system where momentum matters more than mobility. Markets are extraordinarily powerful, but they are not neutral. They respond precisely to the incent. If we reward short-term extraction over long-term investment, we get fragility. If we reward financial engineering over human capital, we get concentration. If we allow loopholes to persist, that privilege complexity over transparency, we get outcomes that favor those best equipped to navigate them. None of this requires malicious intent. It only requires inertia. The greatest mistake is assuming that inequality will correct itself. It rarely does. Without intervention, advantage hardens into permanence. The system becomes less dynamic, less competitive, and ultimately less fair. That should concern anyone who believes in growth, innovation, and merit. Because when markets stop renewing themselves, they stagnate, and stagnation is far more dangerous than reform. Changing this trajectory does not mean abandoning capitalism. It means refining it. Strong systems evolve. They adapt when outcomes drift too far from intent. Altering the rules does not mean equal outcomes. It means fair access to the mechanisms that create opportunity. It means ensuring that effort, talent, and risk-taking are rewarded more than inheritance and positioning. This requires discipline and seriousness. It means examining how capital flows, how incentives are structured, and where barriers have quietly become walls. It means being honest about which policies promote growth and which merely protect incumbency. And it means accepting that doing nothing is itself a choice, one that allows inequality to deepen and trust to erode. If we want a society that remains innovative, competitive, and cohesive, we cannot allow the rules to endlessly reward yesterday's winners at the expense of tomorrow's contributors. Inequality that feeds on itself is not a sign of success. It is a signal that the system needs recalibration. And the sooner that adjustment happens, the stronger and more sustainable. The economy becomes for everyone. If we are serious about narrowing the wealth gap, we have to move past rhetoric and focus on something far more concrete: access. Wealth is not created in a vacuum. It is built through participation in systems that reward education, ownership, and risk-taking. When access to those systems is uneven, outcomes will be uneven. No matter how hard people work, opportunity does not fail because ambition is scarce. It fails because pathways are blocked. Education is the most obvious starting point, and yet we continue to treat it as an expense rather than an investment. Human capital is the single most valuable asset an economy can develop. When education quality depends on geography or income, we are effectively deciding whose potential is worth cultivating. That is not only unjust, it is economically irrational. The return on investing in education from early childhood through workforce reskilling consistently exceeds the cost. Skills drive productivity, productivity drives growth, and growth creates wealth. The math is straightforward, but education alone is not enough. Access to capital matters just as much. Entrepreneurship, homeownership, and small business formation are among the most powerful engines of wealth creation in America. Yet for millions of capable individuals, the cost of entry is simply too high. Credit is expensive, collateral is scarce, and risk is punished rather than supported. When people with strong ideas cannot secure capital, innovation stalls. When renters cannot transition to owners, wealth accumulation slows. When small businesses cannot scale, communities stagnate. Access also means financial literacy and inclusion. Understanding how to save, invest, insure against risk, and plan for the long term is not intuitive, it is learned. For too many Americans, that education arrives late or not at all. As a result, people make decisions in the dark, often paying hidden costs for complexity and misinformation. A system that depends on participation must also ensure transparency. Complexity should not be a barrier to entry, it should be a tool for growth. Technology presents both a challenge and an opportunity here. The digital economy can widen gaps if access is limited, but it can also democratize opportunity at scale. Remote learning, digital banking, and online marketplaces reduce friction and expand reach. When paired with thoughtful policy, technology can compress distance, lower cost, and broaden participation. Ignored, it can do the opposite. Direction matters. Critically, access must be designed to empower, not to create dependency. The goal is not to insulate people from risk, but to give them a fair chance to take it. Progress requires confidence that effort will be rewarded, that failure will not be fatal, and that success is achievable without privileged entry points. That confidence fuels innovation and mobility. If we want a more balanced economy, we must stop asking why people are falling behind and start asking where the gates are locked. Access to quality education, affordable capital, housing, and financial tools is not a social favor. It is economic infrastructure. Build it well, and growth becomes broader, stronger, and more durable. Neglect it, and inequality hardens into permanence. The choice is not ideological, it is practical. Solving the wealth gap does not require choosing between growth and fairness. That framing is false, and it has held us back for far too long. The real challenge is alignment, making sure our policies, incentives, and capital flows reward long-term value creation rather than short-term extraction. When policy is designed intelligently, wealth creation can expand without becoming concentrated, and growth can IFT participation instead of narrowing it. Markets respond to incentives with remarkable precision. If we incentivize productive investment, capital will flow into innovation, infrastructure, and human development. If we incentivize speculation and loopholes, capital will flow into complexity, arbitrage, and concentration. The outcomes we see today are not accidental. They reflect decades of choices embedded in tax codes, regulatory frameworks, and public investment priorities. The question is not whether policy shapes markets. It always does. The question is whether it shapes them wisely. A modernized tax and incentive framework is a powerful lever. When income from labor is taxed more heavily than income from capital, we quietly signal that ownership matters more than contribution. When long-term investment is treated the same as short-term speculation, we blur the line between building value and extracting it. Smart reform doesn't punish success. It differentiates between behaviors that strengthen the economy and those that merely exploit it. Incentives should reward patience, reinvestment, and growth that extends beyond quarterly results. Public investment plays a complementary role. Infrastructure, research, and workforce development are not ideological expenses. They are the foundation of competitive advantage. Every major economic expansion in history has been supported by targeted public investment that unlocked private innovation. Roads, ports, broadband, energy systems, and scientific research lower costs and expand opportunity for everyone. When these investments are neglected, capital becomes defensive rather than expansive, chasing scarcity instead of creating abundance. Equally important is regulatory clarity. Uncertainty discourages long-term planning. Clear, consistent rules allow businesses to invest with confidence, hire more people, and commit capital to long-horizon projects. Overregulation can suffocate growth, but underregulation breeds instability and mistrust. The goal is balance. Rules that protect competition, prevent abuse, and preserve market integrity without stifling innovation. Healthy markets require trust, and trust is built through transparency and fairness. Policy must also recognize the pace of change. Technological disruption will continue to reshape industries and labor markets. That is inevitable. What is not inevitable is leaving workers unprepared. Incentives for retraining, mobility, and skill development ensure that disruption becomes a source of renewal rather than dislocation. When people can adapt, the economy becomes more resilient. When they cannot, inequality deepens. Ultimately, smart policy is not about ideology. It is about outcomes. Does it expand opportunity? Does it reward productive risk-taking? Does it strengthen the foundation of growth? When the answer is yes, wealth creation becomes broader and more sustainable. When the answer is no, concentration accelerates and trust erodes. We do not need radical solutions. We need disciplined ones. Policies that respect markets, harness capital, and invest in people. When those elements align, the economy does what it does best: grow, not just at the top, but across the entire spectrum of society. At the center of the wealth gap debate is a simple but often avoided truth: opportunity and reward have drifted out of balance. An economy functions best when effort, skill, and risk-taking are the primary drivers of success. When rewards become increasingly detached from contribution and increasingly tied to position, the system loses credibility. People stop believing that progress is earned, and once that belief weakens, growth itself is at risk. Opportunity is not meaningful if it exists only in theory. It must be reachable, visible, and realistic. That means the pathways to advancement, education, ownership, entrepreneurship, and career mobility cannot be reserved for those who start with advantages. A system that concentrates opportunity at the top eventually starves itself of new ideas, new energy, and new leadership. Renewal depends on circulation, not preservation. Reward, on the other hand, must remain powerful. Incentives matter. Innovation does not happen without the possibility of meaningful upside. The mistake is not rewarding success. The mistake is protecting it from competition. When markets become closed ecosystems where incumbency is safer than innovation, progress slows. The goal is not to compress outcomes, but to expand entry. The most dynamic economies are not those with the smallest differences, but those with the greatest mobility. This balance requires intentional design. Education systems must prepare people not just to participate, but to compete. Capital markets must remain open to new entrants, not dominated by scale alone. Labor markets must reward skills and adaptability, not just credentials or tenure. When reward is aligned with value creation, productivity rises and inequality becomes a byproduct of contribution rather than privilege. Rebalancing opportunity and reward also means confronting intergenerational dynamics. When wealth becomes hereditary rather than productive, it distorts incentives. Capital should be a tool for growth, not a mechanism for permanent advantage. Encouraging reinvestment, philanthropy with accountability, and long-term capital formation ensures that wealth remains active rather than inert. Idle capital serves no one. There is also a cultural dimension. A healthy economy celebrates ambition, resilience, and improvement. It recognizes failure as part of progress, not a permanent mark. When people believe they can recover, they take risks. When they believe one mistake will define them, they retreat. Mobility requires psychological safety as much as financial access. The objective is not equality of outcome, it is equality of possibility. That distinction matters. When people see a future worth striving for, they invest in themselves, their families, and their communities. That investment compounds in ways no policy alone can replicate. A system that balances opportunity and reward does more than reduce inequality. It restores confidence. Confidence that effort matters. Confidence that markets are fair. Confidence that tomorrow can be better than today. And with that confidence comes growth that is not fragile or narrow, but broad, resilient, and enduring. That is how a strong economy sustains itself, not by protecting advantage, but by constantly renewing it. So let's be clear about what this moment demands. The wealth gap is not a verdict on our future. It is a test of our discipline, our imagination, and our willingness to act with intention instead of inertia. Strong economies are not defined by how much wealth they create at the top, but by how widely opportunity is distributed at the bottom and the middle. This is not about tearing anything down. It is about building something better. An economy where success is earned, not inherited, where effort has a visible payoff, where failure is not permanent, and where ambition is met with access instead of walls. The next era of growth will not come from protecting old advantages. It will come from unlocking new participants, from investing in people who have been excluded not because they lacked ability, but because they lacked access. When more people can build wealth, everyone benefits. Productivity rises, innovation accelerates, and stability replaces fragility. History is clear on this point. Systems that refuse to evolve eventually collapse under their own weight. But systems that adapt, that rebalance opportunity and reward, don't just survive, they lead. The wealth gap can close, not overnight, not through slogans, but through smart rules, disciplined policy, and a renewed belief that markets work best when everyone has a real stake in the outcome. The future of the American economy will not be decided by how much wealth exists, but by who gets the chance to create it. And that choice is still ours.